Okay, we're good to go now. Thanks for waiting. It went faster than I expected again. All right, so the first recorded literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, was written in 2700 BC. The first known song, Hurrying Hymn Number 6, was written in 1300 BC. The first recorded music, Au clair de la lune, was tracked in 1860 AD. The first film, Roundhead Garden Scene, was captured in 1888 AD. The first video game, Tennis for Two, 1958 AD, exactly 60 years old. Looking at revenue numbers, we can see that print media generated around $30.47 billion last year. What about the music industry? Well, they brought in about $47.5 billion, which then was absolutely dwarfed by film. They achieved a colossal $93.74 billion in last year. The video game industry, however, it beat them all. It clocked in at about $116 billion. So games aren't just a new medium, they are the new medium. But then, what is a video game? That's a question that really doesn't get asked often, at least not by anyone under the age of 50. By definition, a video game is a game that is played by electronically manipulating images produced by a computer program or on a television screen or other display screen. But what actually is a video game? What makes them tick? Why are they different than other forms of media? Similarly to print or music or film, video games aren't a single genre, but are rather separated by traits into many different genres. So it would be unwise to say games are art, or games are violent, or label them in any way at all. One does not say movies are scary. However, there is one defining feature of a video game that is necessary for an entry to be considered part of the medium. Video games are interactive. Without this defining component, a game would instead be a film or an ebook. This is a unique feature of the medium in that the audience has choices, and those choices have consequences. So, other than interactivity, what can a game be? And in the opposite argument, what can a game not be? We're going to look at a wide variety of games to explore this concept. I enjoy and play many games, so these examples will range from large commercial hits to small, not very well-known independent titles. Don't expect to recognize all, or even most of these games. To start off, we're going to go way back to the 70s. Back to the Atari 800, back to Zork, a game developed by MIT for use on a PDP-10. The PDP-10 was a room-sized supercomputer. Later, they did split it into a trilogy that could be run on home computers, though. Zork was an adventure game. It encouraged the player to explore, find treasure, and evade the Grue. In the end, reaching the bottom of the endless stair and becoming the master of the dungeon. Zork had a story, one that you actually encountered in-game. Today, that is commonplace. But remember, this is the 70s. Zork was one of the first games to have a self-contained story. I mean, this is what they were playing back then. Good games? Yeah, they were fun. Good self-contained story? Not really. So, according to Zork, what can a game be or do? A game can be an adventure. It can inspire exploration whilst also containing a self-evident story. A story which is explained to the player in-game. Then, in the context of Zork, what can a game not be? Visual. A common misconception is that games are an inherently visual and graphical medium like film. Let's take a look at what Zork actually looks like when you're playing. Zork has no graphic art in the game itself. It is entirely played through a command line interface. You interact by entering instructions like go left, go up, pick up sword, kill Grue with sword. To which you'll get the response, I've known strange people, but fighting a lurking Grue? Zork has no split-second decisions, no need for reflexes, just logical thinking and a good memory. The idea of a text-based adventure breaks many modern game conventions, and definitely isn't for everyone. Many people just don't enjoy reading. In fact, they avoid doing so if at all possible. There we go. It is in this conflict of interest that the versatility of this medium is most apparent. Meet Hyper Light Drifter, a 2016 indie title by the studio Heart Machine. And this little recommendation here? This is the most text you will see anywhere in the game. Not only the most text, but the most words. Hyper Light Drifter has no text and no voiceover. It has a rich story and a well-built world with history and feeling, all conveyed through visuals, an experiment in wordless storytelling through gameplay. The story is about destruction and aftermath of that turmoil. An unnamed darkness has set on the land, a corruption of sorts. How it is identified and labeled is purposely vague, to allow it to be all-encompassing, while letting the player mentally configure it into their ideal version of a faceless, formless, pure evil. You arrive after the destruction has taken place, left to piece together the past in order to understand the future, your future. There are no surviving texts, only archaic monoliths with illegible hieroglyphs. Nothing to give you a detailed bearing of what has happened. Only demolished buildings and skeletal corpses of colossal beings long dead. This negative space of story seems to be, at first glance, just an overlooked part of the game. It is, however, a very intentional design choice, reinforced by a strong backbone of level design. Everyone has a different experience, as their brain fills in details of the story differently. Yet all experiences have similarities because of constraints. Each person has their own version of the same story. While you are never explicitly told what has caused this destruction, by littering the corpses of colossi around the world, it is implied that these beings had some connection. Since it isn't specified whether they were destroying or being destroyed, you might believe they were attacking. Whereas I could believe that they were there to defend against some unknown threat. Both are equally correct and equally incorrect for all one may know within the given information and parameters. This structured ambiguity leads to a unique story for each person. Wordlessly. A world built for the intent of crafting a story, a tale of previous days into each encounter, each object, each interaction. Each space is handcrafted to have engaging, intuitive gameplay, visual clarity, and narrative hints. If you'd like to hear more about how Hyper Light Drifter conveys story through world building, I created a video breaking it down into more detail. It's only 10 minutes long, so it shouldn't take up much of your time. Just look this up on YouTube, and you'll find it. Games have a variety of methods and opportunities to tell a story, either fully textual, completely graphical, or a combination of both. But can games do more? Can a game make you think? First, I should probably explain what I mean by think. Inherently, any action or choice requires thought, and games are made up of actions and choices to take. So on a basic level, every game makes one think. One step deeper, puzzles and challenges make the player think in a logical manner. To complete the given choice or action, one must first overcome the obstacle. Entire games are built off that concept, even eschewing the mainstay of video games, combat, just for that activity. Portal. A game about portals. Really creative title, right? Don't judge a book or a game by its cover, though. Portal is one of the most popular and recognizable games ever made. Normally, this would be a big deal already. Then add to that achievement that it's a non-combat oriented game, and then add on top of that it's from puzzle games, a non-mainstream genre. And it seems like an impossibility that this would happen. So what did Portal do to the puzzle game genre that made it fun and popular to think logically, instead of just shooting at anything that moves? Valve, the developer of Portal, started by designing the game with a sense of familiarity. Familiarity to the first-person shooters such as Call of Duty or Battlefield, which, at that point in time when this game was created, were the most popular games being created. How did they do that? Well, they started by creating the game from a recognizable viewpoint. Many fantastic puzzle games such as Gorogoa or Manifold Garden have one playing from an abnormal perspective, and it can be difficult to grab even the basic concepts of that game because of the core aspect. On the other hand, Portal was created in the popular first-person design style, which also happens to be the exact same perspective you live your life in. Not only was Portal built in first person, but the levels were easy to read. High contrast, modern, clean design, and clear goals and motives all contributed to this idea. The difficult part was not figuring out what to do, but rather solving the puzzle of how to get to the goal. From the very first glance at the level, you could tell exactly what the goal was. The contrast also added clarity to what one could and could not do. Certain surfaces were off limits to the player, so the surfaces would be the inverse color of those that the player was intended to use. Instead of decreasing difficulty, this readability made each puzzle feel fair, doable, and fun, instead of confusing. Portal's puzzles were based around another familiar object, a gun. Specifically, the portal gun. This gun shoots portals. Shocker. You might be seeing a pattern in Valve's naming scheme at this point. These portals were the basis of gameplay, as implied by the title. Walk in one portal, you come out the other. At first, they're used like this, to traverse unreachable terrain. However, later in the game, they are used to perform a range of activities, from redirecting deadly lasers and creating bridges of light to breaking physics by falling indefinitely in an effort to build up enough speed to launch oneself across a previously impassable environment. Portal made its mark by being easy to pick up and understand, yet containing a depth that allowed players to grow. It introduced logical thinking in games to a larger audience than was previously included in the genre of puzzle games. It had depth and opportunities for the player to forge their own path, but didn't leave them floundering for any idea of where to go. Beyond critical thinking, what can games do? Beyond just logic, can a game affect one emotionally and converse about mature topics in a serious manner, similar to that expected of film or textual media? Yeah, absolutely. Some in less direct manners than others, but very much so. A large portion of my research in this project was actually around concepts of the impact of games emotionally. So to start, we'll be discussing BioShock Infinite. Not a game that would immediately come to one's mind when talking about morality, which is precisely why I chose it. This game is a first-person shooter, so the player interfaces with the game in the same manner they would as in a game like Call of Duty. And as I stated before, players interact with it from the same viewpoint as they would everyday life. It's a very story-driven game that has no qualms about being fictional. I mean, it's set in a flying city named New Columbia. Technically, BioShock would be classified as historical science fiction, as it is set in the year 1912. As such, BioShock uses that time period to allow the game to be a platform for discussions on racism, though it doesn't display that in the way one would expect. There aren't any direct messages to players saying that racism is bad anywhere in the game. Instead, it encourages players to draw these conclusions by showing the ugly reality of extreme racism in the early 1900s, and by extension, how disgusting racism is in any context. Through the unique interactivity of the medium of the games, the player doesn't just observe passively like they would in a film or reading a book. Instead, they are there, participating, involved, invested in the world. They have the ability and option to do something, make a difference, or do nothing. The most explicit demonstration of this is found in the raffle scene early in the game. In essence, this scene is the lynching of an interracial couple, a disgusting common practice in the time period of BioShock. However, this isn't a burning at the stake or other sort of witch hunt-esque image that the word lynch conjures up in many minds. In fact, it's designed to look pleasant upon first observation of the scene, like a raffle or a competition at a local fair. And for all the player knows, that's exactly what it is. This unfamiliarity and lack of knowledge beforehand is intentionally set up to create a visual and emotional dissonance, set to make the player feel more strongly than if they were going into the encounter expecting what's going to happen. Premonitions of the sinister turn are apparent, but designed in a way that they aren't conclusive. One cannot quite understand exactly what is going to happen, but will likely have a sense of unease, not fitting their current knowledge of the event. The raffle tickets are baseballs, labeled with what looks like black Sharpie, and when calling the assistant to pick the winning number, the announcer says, "Is that not the prettiest young white girl in Columbia?" The voiceover is recorded with a subtle yet specific emphasis on white. And on closer inspection, one would find there is not a single person of color in the crowd surrounding the stage. At this point, most players have recognized and understood that something is very off about this whole scenario. There are many subtle and not so subtle racist undertones to the entire situation, but what is going to happen? The scene is programmed so the player will always win the raffle. No matter what they do or how they approach the scene, they will win. This is extremely important to what happens next. The prize for winning the raffle is the opportunity to throw the winning ticket at the couple on stage. This is a stoning masquerading as a fairground type event. This jump from being a raffle is shocking and for many creates intense feelings of anger. Not towards the game for showing them such a scene, but in most situations actually towards the announcer on screen, the virtual character facilitating the monstrous event. The player stands feeling helpless as the crowd taunts the couple standing on stage, bound and begging for mercy. As the player is still reeling from the shock and hasn't yet thrown the ball, the announcer continues to pile on slurs and degrading comments, teasing the player with statements like, "Come on, are you going to throw it? Or are you taking your coffee black these days?" Shortly afterwards, he throws back his head and laughs manically, almost like he's enjoying the player's discomfort in confronting this issue, further cementing himself as the source of the player's frustration and bringing with him his racist tendencies, labeling those even more intensely as a cause for frustration and anger. Something unwanted and unwelcome. As the scenario draws towards the conclusion, a choice is provided to the player. Do I fit in with the crowd? Do I choose to throw my ball at the couple? Or will I stand up against injustice and stand up for them? Will I attack the announcer with my throw and denounce what he stands for? By presenting the player with a choice, they are given a greater impact on the situation. Beyond what they're generally used to in situations like that, they're given an opportunity to do something, to make a difference. They have to choose if they believe it is okay for them to treat someone in an inhumane manner and devalue, degrade, and diminish them as a person, or if they believe that everyone is a human being, and even if it's more dangerous and less convenient, they will continue to treat people as such. BioShock does all of this through an experience. Another game that does so, also brilliantly, is a small independent title called This War of Mine. This is a game dedicated to providing a look at the side of war we often avoid. What do I mean by that? Well, especially in games, we tend to focus on the elite soldiers, the Spartans, the SWAT teams, the frontline combatants. This War of Mine avoids those trappings completely. In war, not everyone is a soldier. So instead, you are leading a group of civilians, just trying to survive a war-torn city based on the 1992 to 1995 siege of Sarajevo during the Bosnian War, the longest modern siege. A large focus is placed on the lengths people will go to survive and the effects of those actions on their mind. It has an advanced system built into the character engine to give your survivors debilitating mental traits when encountering certain circumstances. One of these traits is triggered when the characters must choose whether to steal from another group of survivors in order to eat. They know that they are sentencing the other group to death, and after the theft, they'll feel guilty and become extremely depressed. To continue displaying this point, you have no choice but to watch the consequences of your actions, because you as the player will continue to see the group of players that you stole from on your screen. So as their child asks why there isn't any food, as they all slowly wither away from hunger, you know this is your fault. As they pass away one by one, you have to watch them grieve and bury their family. When there's finally one left, sitting quietly mourning, you have to watch as they sit there and slowly pass away. Sometimes your survivors will try to rationalize it, pretend it didn't happen. Many times they fall into deep depression, knowing they took someone else's life just so they could eat. Often they become so distraught that they just decide to end it. Every survivor has a name. They have a face, a personality. They're built in a way that they feel like actual people, so that when you're losing them, it hurts more than just losing a useful member to the team. You're losing someone who was there during this whole encounter. A game like this is a far departure from the war-glorifying shooters that one expects from video games, and depicts a side of conflict that we in the United States don't often see, or even consider, the side of combat that actually many spend large portions of their lives experiencing, a struggle just for basic survival. Games can offer experiences, something that no other medium can do. One is involved. Not viewing, not observing, but actually interacting. This can lead to intense emotional reactions in some situations. One game that does this particularly well is simply titled Train. Created by Brenda Braithwaite Romero, the video game director at the University of Limerick in Ireland. Train isn't a video game. In fact, it's more of an interactive art piece. But it's built on the concepts she uses in a regular basis on her work in games. Train is described as a game that explores complicity within systems, designed to ask, will people blindly follow the rules? And will people stand by and watch? What is Train? Well, first a primer on flow theory. Flow theory was created by this guy, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He is a Hungarian psychologist, and while studying the effect of games on the brain, he developed this idea of how to keep a game entertaining. In concept, it's very similar to the zone that many talk about in relation to sports. Flow is the feeling of complete and energized focus on a task. When someone is running comfortably at their maximum potential, the challenge is neither too easy nor too hard. This is very bright, but it's the visualization of that called a flowchart. So if the player is too skilled for the scenario, they'll be bored. Whereas if they aren't skilled enough, they may be anxious or stressed. Flow is when a game is most enjoyable, or following along the center track, right there. So what does this have to do with Train? Well, Train is completely built around flow. It is a game in which players move train cars of passengers to an undisclosed location. They have to figure out how to best fill the cars with passengers, and then must pass multiple challenges and rail blockages to move forwards to reach the destination. Throughout the passage of the game, flow is created and cultivated, making the player feel proud of their accomplishments and want to complete the challenge to the best of their ability. It creates a positive emotional feeling and a sense of pride. And right as the game is drawing to a close, that all comes crashing down. How? Well, the destination is revealed to the player. Where are you carrying your players in such an efficient manner? Auschwitz. Discovery completely flips the experience, changing flow from a source of pride and enjoyment to the origin of suffering and guilt. The player's flow has caused the delivery of multiple boxcars worth of prisoners to concentration camps. It is one of the very few examples of using flow in a game to create negative emotion, and it did so to great effect. Many players began to weep, and most recorded genuine feelings of remorse, guilt, and sorrow. Intense feelings, an extreme switch from their previous positive emotions. The cause of their extreme reaction doesn't only stem from the Nazi relation, but also through the idea that they were enjoying themselves, and their actions and decisions had aided the cause of something horrendous and awful. Games are an extremely versatile form of media, capable of, yet not often recognized as an emotional medium. Will Wright, the creator of The Sims, said, "People talk about how games don't have the emotional impact of movies. I think they do. They just have a different palette. I never felt pride or guilt watching a movie." People think games don't have an emotional impact on those who play them, at least beyond the stereotype of game-induced rage. Much of this doubt in games as a medium stems from its youth, not yet having the opportunity to prove itself. Games are treated as a novelty, not as an art form. Like a toy, not like something legitimate, like film or textual media. However, the widespread adoption of gaming in younger generations shows they are taking this more seriously, and as they grow older, the group that denounces games will grow even less prevalent. Video games are also industry-leading in entertainment, not only in revenue, but in growth. Because of that, I feel more than safe putting my trust into games as a career, which is exactly why I chose game development as the topic for my senior project. Brief primer on me for anyone who doesn't know. I love games, board games, tabletop role-playing games, video games, pretty much anything. I'll play it. I've been playing and creating games since I was really young. Rainy days were some of my favorite times, since everyone was stuck inside and I could force them to play my latest creation. Bella and Josie can confirm that. I can't claim my games were any good, but I did enjoy making them, throughout all those years, it never actually occurred to me that my hobby was a legitimate career path, and that someone actually got paid to make the games that I spent my time playing. I was dumb. I know. That thought process changed about 6 years ago. In 7th grade, I met Andrew Gifford. A senior at the time, his capstone project being on narrative structure in video games. Somehow, I got him to talk to me. I don't really know how, but I did, and he recommended that I do a project on game design. He thought it would align well with my interests. He was spot on. My first project was on game development in GameMaker 8.1. Honestly, a pretty awful piece of software by today's standards. Well, it wasn't even good then, but it was my first foray into creating something digital for others to play. I spent hours grinding away at the game, and I was really proud of it. Looking back, maybe I shouldn't have been, but that's a different story for a different time. This expanded in my 8th grade plans. I spent the entire year working on game development, exploring each facet of game development in depth with its own project. 5 projects in total: programming, sound effects, music, narrative, and art and design. I teamed up with a few friends and attempted to make a real game. By real game, I mean something that was planned out and constructed with quality art, quality music, and well-programmed. Something I hadn't done the previous year, and something that I did not end up doing that year either. I learned a ton, but I definitely did not make a game. I jumped in way over my head, but still discovered something that defined the focus of my career plans. I no longer just wanted to make video games. I wanted to design video games. I wanted to be the creative and execute plans, which I finally got to do the next year, my freshman year. This opportunity was presented through a new student who could apparently draw. Yep, this thing. I had absolutely no idea who Cam was, so obviously I asked him to make a video game with me. For some reason, he said yes. Probably regretted that immediately. Probably still does. Turns out he could actually draw, though, so this was the beginning of a project spanning 3 years and easily topping 300 hours. Throughout those 3 years, I designed and redesigned the game. Created a grand idea, and then cut it down because it was too much. And then cut that down again. I learned to work with people in a collaborative setting, how to make art requests, and how to better explain myself. I tried to contact publishers and then gotten told in no uncertain terms to contact them when I actually have a game they can sell. I developed an intense interest in psychology of video games, and I also made connections. My dad helped me get in contact with Mike Lund. Mike is the Resident Evil brand manager for Capcom USA. That's a pretty awesome contact to have. It was a fantastic interview, almost 2 hours of just talking about the video game industry. He was immensely helpful, not only then, but later on. We stayed in contact and he was able to answer questions during the whole project. I also did, a lot, a ridiculous amount of programming over those projects. So, 10 game development projects, 810 hours, 8.61 credits later, and we arrive at this year. My last year, hopefully. Also brings us to the senior project. You know, the project that seems awesome until your senior year, where then you find out it's okay, but also extremely stressful and time consuming. Senior project is your life, get ready for it. I decided to approach this project from a different angle though. I've always tried to make games, right? Always spent most of my time programming. So I decided to completely reverse my approach, heading to the proposal table proclaiming, I will not make a game in this project. Maybe. And I didn't. I actually kept my word. The intent of that goal was so that I could research and analyze, not spend 300 more hours programming to realize my dream game. I decided to spend a lot of my time researching the psychological elements I had found so interesting previously, with spatterings of research on more practical stuff from the game developer conference panels. Mike Lund came into play again, and he was a great help with my plans for PAX and just other questions I had. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do a sit-down interview this time, but he was more willing to answer questions as I had them. So, what's PAX? Well, the Penny Arcade Expo is a trio of conferences in the mainland United States that many game developers, system manufacturers, and other gaming-related brands come to display their products and network at. I chose PAX for 2 reasons. First, it's one of the cheaper conferences to go to, and secondly, Capcom would be there, which also means Mike would be there. I went with my dad, and we were able to attend lots of panels, with topics ranging from understanding the video game canon and designing balance, to how to actually get yourself a job in the field. I was able to learn fantasy world building from and talk to Michael Dante DiMartino, who you may better know as the creator of Avatar: The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra. I also had the opportunity to learn the importance of versatility in the video game industry from George Lacerda, the lead concept artist for BioShock Infinite. And when I had time to spare, I spent it on the show floor. This picture doesn't even capture half of the show floor in frame. I had the opportunity to talk to many developers, mostly small indie studios. While that could sound disappointing, most large studios don't actually bring design teams with them to expos, whereas normally the entire indie team is needed to just man their booth. So by talking to more indies, I was actually able to talk to more designers than I would have been able to otherwise. I was still able to find time to talk with other larger studios as well, as I stopped at the Devolver Digital booth and Capcom's booth. When I stopped at the Capcom booth, I was finally able to meet with Mike, and we talked for a little while. He even offered to let me skip the 3-hour line to play Monster Hunter World before release. Obviously, took him up on that offer. PAX was an amazing experience, and I'd love to go again. Or even maybe go to a larger conference like E3, which is the largest gaming conference in the world. Next year, I'll be heading all the way out to Utah, where I'll be attending the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. Their school is among the top 3 in the world for game development, as claimed by the Princeton Review, matching up with universities like the University of Southern California and NYU. It is also by far the cheapest of the top 3. I've accepted that I'll be beyond broke no matter what school I attend, but I'd like to accumulate as little debt as possible. I will be taking a Bachelor's of Science in Gaming through their Entertainment, Arts, and Engineering program, and also likely minoring in Japanese, as I feel like that's a language choice that's kind of relevant to my choice in career. I've also looked through the course plans for my major, and I'm really excited to take classes. Not going to miss this beautiful Wisconsin weather, though. And if I remember correctly, it's now your turn to grill me with questions for 30 minutes. 20 minutes, not 30. Please don't make it 30. Fire away. I mean, you can make it 30 if you really want, but please don't. Jared?
Straight up, what's your favorite game?
All right, Jared asks what's my favorite game. I think I'd have to go with Super Metroid. Percival?
Lots of people try and go for horror, the horror genre in games, and they usually fail miserably. Would you say if you're talking to someone who wants to make a game and they're set on making a horror game, would you suggest going to a genre that they probably feel more comfortable with, or something completely different?
Okay, so Percival was asking if you're going to make a horror game, that is a competitive area of independent titles. So would you recommend just going to a different genre? I think part of what you should think about when doing that is, do you have an original idea? Because if you're just making another horror game that's spooky and gory and scary or whatever, you're not going to find anything new. The games that succeed are the ones that do something that's different. So even if you move into a different genre of games, if you don't have something new to bring to the table, your game isn't going to succeed pretty much at all. Like, if we go into examples like part of why Outlast was so successful is because instead of just being another Amnesia, where the concept was you just can't attack or anything, they added more mechanics like the video camcorder, where then you can see in the dark, so it's not just jump scares in the dark, and you knew things were happening. So just adding new things to the entire game doesn't have to be a new concept. Just adding a new concept that differentiates you from the other options. Danny?
When you went to the thing where you saw all the
Mhm.
did you see the Epic Games panel?
Danny asks if there was an Epic Games booth at PAX, and I'm afraid there wasn't. They were not there at that time. Aiden?
Is there a specific genre or company that you would like to work for when designing games?
Aiden asks if there's a company I would prefer to work for. I would really like to work for Riot Games. They're the creator of League of Legends. I like that game a lot, and they're a really good company to work for. They're one of the top 10 companies to work for millennials. Technically, I'm not a millennial, but I'm close enough. All right. Seth?
I have a two-parter, but
Okay.
the second part's really short.
Okay.
So first part, what is the most annoying trope you see in popular video games nowadays?
Okay, so Seth asks, what's the most annoying trope you see in popular video games nowadays? Honestly, guns. I think more games could do without guns. Guns are a fun, easy mechanic to mess with, but I think when you remove them, the developers tend to be more creative and go out of their way to make their game better. My grandma agrees with me.
And then the second part is,
Yep.
What are your thoughts on jump scares in horror games?
Seth then asks, what are my thoughts on jump scares? I think it's an easy out. I think if your entire horror game is based around jump scares, you're not putting in the effort you should. Because I think a better way is the way that a lot of games like the best horror games like Amnesia and Outlast and such do it, where they may have a jump scare every so often just because they are an easy out, but they go through setting up scenes to hold off and then scare you in advance by letting you know something's coming and you have no control over it. William? You're welcome.
So, as you were sort of describing sort of the basic mechanics of the games, I was thinking back to just Super Mario Brothers and
Mhm.
just sort of how easy it is to pick up because it's just 6 buttons, one
Yep.
moves all directions. I guess my question is, what are your thoughts on sort of control in games?
Oh, button creep?
Well, maybe not that, but just sort of like control and sort of the more push towards control or the lack thereof, how you think that affects game design.
I think giving more buttons allows them to do more things. It also lets them be lazy. I think part of the beauty of the earlier systems where they had at most 8 to 10 buttons on their controllers and no analog inputs like joysticks is analog joysticks on as well as buttons is that they had to more consciously think about what they were going to put where and how they were going to make certain things do multiple things at once. Like in Mario, they had the directional pad and then they had 2 buttons. So they wanted to use both of those buttons for different actions. So they figured out how to combine jumping and attacking into a single button so that you wouldn't have to utilize as many actions. So you just land on their head and you're okay. Whereas modern games, they have so many options on their controllers. I mean, what is it? 12 buttons plus 2 analog sticks. And that's only on consoles. If you're going to PC, you have a full keyboard, which can have 128 keys on it, plus a mouse, which can have easily up to 16 keys on it. So, like, there's the ability to do a lot more, but a lot of games end up just lazily being obtuse about their controls. Some of the most interesting games I've played have had the most limited control schemes. There's a game called Downwell that has 3 buttons, a left, right, and a jump button. And your jump button is also your attack button, so when you're falling, you shoot down. And you spend most of the game falling and only jump when you need to. So the buttons reconfigure themselves depending on the action you're doing. And it feels very fluid and smooth, and it ends up being a better experience than playing a game where you have 24 buttons that you have to figure out what does what and try to memorize all of it. I'm bad with... I totally forgot your name, Jesse. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Advice for future seniors? I had an answer. What was it? Well, I think a big part of it is two things. One is just do your work, like homework. People don't like to do that, and I understand, but like if you don't, you're never going to finish everything in school. You're not. It's not going to happen. And then the other thing is, on a more positive note, get out of the building. One of the best parts of my project was leaving and going to PAX. Like, super fun. Got to get into the industry because mine was a more career-based senior project. Got to meet people from the industry. Got to do cool things. Got to visit a new location. Try to go somewhere on your project. Not like go somewhere in your curriculum or something, but like physically leave VNS, and if possible, physically leave the state. Go do something. Go somewhere. Yeah. Sim?
In a game design team, what department would you most likely want to work at?
I would work in the design department. So there's like sound, which will have the SFX, the music. There is the programming teams. There's the graphic art teams, which is split into generally 3D developers, 3D artists, and then that's split into more other categories. I'm not going to go into that. And then there's the design team, which is the team that's pre-building the world. So they're the ones who plan out interactions and give the base idea, and they're also the ones who take the 3D assets that the art team creates and put them into the world. And I forgot to say what her question was, but her question was that where would I prefer to be in a game development team when I go into the industry? Deme?
You talked about the one product that you posted online.
Yep.
And so what else did you do with production?
I wrote a paper on flow theory in games, and I wrote a paper on flow theory, which I talked about in here a little bit, and then I have that video which is posted on YouTube, and those were my products. Yep. Lukey?
Can you talk for a minute about the industry? I'm curious, like,
Mhm.
how many females were in the booths at the convention, and how competitive really is the field as far as, getting in? Is everybody a college graduate now who's in the field, and do they all live in the West Coast? What's the industry like?
Okay. Mrs. Lukey asks, what's the industry like? So pertaining to your question on the quantity of females in the booths, it was definitely predominantly male, but the industry has been making steps in that direction. There were a lot more variants than you would have seen at these conferences even just a few years ago. The scene is definitely expanding to include more than just like middle-class white males. Yeah. And then for like the competitiveness of the scene, it is a very competitive scene as it is an entertainment scene, but there are lots and lots of jobs, and it's constantly growing. It's expected to expand from 116 to about 125 billion next year, or this year, I mean. So it was 116 last year, 125 this year. By 2020, I think it's expected to be over 150 billion, making it one of the largest industries in general, other than like computing and like oil and such. So
Are there local jobs popping up?
right, local jobs, not in this area right now. Wisconsin has a grand total of 3 studios. One of them only works on Call of Duty. So, yeah, most of the jobs are going to be either Japan, South Korea, West Coast, or I don't remember the exact name of the city, but there's a city in Canada that has specific tax laws that make it cheaper for studios if they have land there. So all of the really big studios have some main office in Canada. So that's also a possibility if I don't want to live in LA. Evan?
How many views do you have?
What?
How many viewers do you have?
You're live streaming.
I don't know, and let's keep questions that pertain to my actual senior speech topic. Thank you. Hannah?
How do you feel about the virtual reality game, kind of like a revolution that's been happening in the past few years?
So Hannah asks how I feel about virtual reality games and how that's going to affect the mainstream area of gaming. I think they're really cool. I think they're too expensive right now. A lot of getting a system up and running for VR is upwards of $500 a lot of the times, not including the price of the computer. And computers that run VR can be upwards of $1,000. My laptop is capable of doing that, and my laptop was $2,400. So it's very price prohibitive right now, and a lot of the games play more like demos than they do like an actual game, but they're pricing them like a game. So I think it definitely needs room to grow, but it has potential, and I'm really excited to see where it goes. Oh, wow, still a lot of questions. Okay, Cece?
You know how you said earlier, like, there was like the top 10 game stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Was Epic Games one of them?
For the top 10 game companies?
Yeah.
So Cece asks if Epic Games is one of the top 10 game companies for working for. They are not. Yeah. I'm afraid I don't know your name, but in the back, Steve.
My question is the project you spent 3 years developing.
Yeah.
What language did you use, and what was the most challenging part of that?
Okay. Steve asks for the project that I spent 3 years on with Cam, what language did I use and what was the most difficult part? So I was working in GameMaker because it's a little simpler to work in, but their language is based off of C#, I believe. Most difficult part was starting with programming, because when I went into that, I had no real programming experience, and then trying to figure out when something bugged out. I didn't really know the coding well enough at the time for the first year to actually figure out what went wrong. So there were a lot of little weird workarounds that I went through and had to spend hours just fixing the next time I worked on it, because it was interesting. Yeah. All right, Seth had another one?
What is your least favorite game, and can you give us a tiny little review on it?
Seth asks, what's my least favorite game, and can I give a review on it? That's a hard question. It's a really hard question. What is a game that I really didn't enjoy playing? Well, I can tell you an initial... The day one version of No Man's Sky. The game is okay now, but the day one release was really, really bad. It was super buggy and did not play at all like they advertised it. So I was kind of frustrated about that one, especially because the game was $60. But I wasn't the only one who was frustrated about that. Enough people were frustrated that everyone was given full refunds. So, except for console players. Wilson?
So I'm curious to know, like, how graphical power keeps on increasing and increasing, so that in the near future, games will probably reach a photorealistic look. I'm
Mhm.
curious to know if you have a preference for photorealism in video games, or if you like more abstract, more unique art styles in video games.
So Wilson asks if I prefer more abstract, unique art styles or photorealism. I like both. Most games don't pull off photorealistic very well, is what I've seen and experienced. I think games that can look good years after they were released is a better idea to go for. So games like Wind Waker wasn't necessarily commercially received super well when it came out because it wasn't dark and moody and realistic, but years down the line right now, Wind Waker looks gorgeous still, and it's on the GameCube. So, like, the GameCube didn't even have an HDMI out. That's, like, so, if that gives you an idea of, like, the age of it. There are a few games that have pulled it off relatively well. Star Citizen is one of them where, like, the photorealism of it looks quite nice, given it is still sci-fi as it's spaceships, but, like, photorealistic to the sense of it looks like what you'd assume that object would look like. But for the most part, I prefer stylistic games. In fact, most of the games I play extensively are 2D. Mr. DeMay?
With the presentation you took us through, what is there like a main thesis or a takeaway that you wanted the audience to have about games that you think they didn't have?
So the main takeaway that I was intending for this presentation is what Mr. DeMay asked. I think the big part of it for me was that people bringing more of an understanding that games are more than what you generally see the commercially viable products as. Because the large commercial viable products are generally fall into the zone of let's put people onto an online server with each other and have them shoot each other. That's in general what the big games have been. There's variations in there where Skyrim was super successful, and it's like, but it still involves just, hey, let's emotionlessly murder things. So just bringing an idea of like games do have the capacity to actually inspire thought. They aren't just a mindless, hey, let's get on the computer and beat things to a pulp and then do something else. Like they can and have been and will continue to be pieces that can be considered art, as well as pieces that are just mindless fun. So that games have a bigger range than most people believe. Mrs. Kozlowski?
So you just answered a question that I had at the beginning where you had said games are art, not art.
Correct.
I asked you what you felt about that, whether they were art, and then if so, if you would label them as art, in the rest of the art world, there is high art and there is low art. So what's the proportion? What defines high art and low art in video games? And then maybe what's the proportion of high art and low art in the indie studios and those games versus commercial?
Okay. Ms. Kozlowski asks the variation between high art and low art in video games and how that differentiates itself between indie and commercial studios. So I'd say the majority of games either wouldn't be considered art or would be considered low art. Similar to like how you would consider an action film. So something like, I don't know, a Marvel movie. So it's like, it's fun, but like you look at it and you wouldn't go, this is a work of art. Like, but there are games that do go out of their way to present themselves in a very thoughtful artistic sense. Artistic more in the idea of film than in the idea of a traditional piece of art, where it's a picture. That was a really big understatement, but you know what I mean. So stuff like, I'm not very well versed on film. Will would probably be better to come up with examples for that. But pieces of film that are designed to inspire thought and are less intended as a means of entertainment and more as something to make you think and feel are generally what I've seen more considered as an artistic piece of film, and the same can go for games. There's this really fantastic game called Journey. It's only on the PS3, and I think they remastered for the PS4. It's a really simplistic game, and game developers are really creative with their titles. You're on a journey in this game, but you basically are just walking through by yourself, walking through a place, and your goal is to just get to the end. Sort of, it's really short. It's only like 2 hours long. But throughout, they have a multiplayer component where other players can show up, but there isn't any voice chat. There isn't any text chat. You have actually no way of communicating with them. You guys are just supposed to work together to reach the goal. And the whole idea of that was to help the player understand the difference between solitary and actually connecting with someone, but avoiding having a more conversational connection, so that when you were alone in the game, you felt isolated and alone, and when you're together, you felt sort of in unity with the other person. And so that's more of the lean of art in games, is ideas, sort of. Yeah.
And the second part?
Yeah.
Indie versus commercial?
Indie versus commercial. Commercial, in general, doesn't. The only commercial game in my in this presentation was BioShock, and that was a rarity. That was unexpected and really cool that they did that. But commercial titles tend to aim towards more of the side of Call of Duty and that sort of thing. Indie titles are the ones that normally come out with the ideas, like Journey. Journey's an independent title, and the thing with it is they do that because they don't have to have as high of profit margins, because I think Journey was developed by 15 or less people, whereas the standard Call of Duty game is developed by like 100,000 people. So they go for the game. One goes for the game that will sell 10 million copies. The other goes for the game that may only sell 100,000 copies, but it's the game they wanted to make. All right. Cam?
So when we go to sit down to make a game, that I know how we kind of brainstormed.
Mm-hmm.
It was a little bit kind of lacking out there about every idea imaginable. But
Yep.
what kind of brainstorming process do you take before creating one of your own games?
So Cam just asked, what brainstorming process do I go through when I go to create one of my own games? I'm very kinesthetic and also visual. So I like to sit down and just start drawing, and I'm by no means an artist. So it doesn't look good, but it lets me get my ideas down. And so I like to create like an idea of a world and what this could look like in a game. And then when I create this idea of a world, as I'm creating it, I create a backstory for why this is there, how this world happened, and I build the game around that. So a few ideas I've had just involve various things, but one of them was a sort of Victorian-esque world that I was drawing. And then an idea came to my mind, because it's still picture, nothing moves. What if everything was paused, except for an area around the player? So to interact with the world, then you have to get near something for something to change, and then you play by judging your distances based off of how things might move when you get near them. And so just a whole concept of that. And so I generally, when I come up with an idea, then I write it down and then go into more detail as I go on. Yeah. Sophie? Got it.
So you talked about the game that you made. Is it playable? And if so, are you gonna let people play it?
Okay, so Sophie asks about the game that I made. If it was playable, and if I'm gonna let people play it. Kind of playable. I mean, it worked, and we had 1 or 2 levels done, but by no means a full release. That's why the publishers told me that I should come to them when I have an actual game. So no, I'm not in a position to be letting people play that. Yeah, sorry. Mrs. Luki?
What is the potential extent of psychological impact of games
So Mrs. Luki asks, what's the extent of the psychological impact of games, ranging more towards the idea of violence in games, but also just how it affects in the more introspective sense. I haven't looked into it a ton, but there's been a lot of studies done on the violence in video games, and for the most part, currently, the general consensus is that playing a violent video game does not cause you to be a violent person, and a lot of people actually use violent video games as an outlet. Are you okay if I tell this? Josie got home mad at some point recently, and she just comes home, looks at my mom and goes, I'm going to go kill things in League of Legends. Goes downstairs and just starts playing until she calmed down. So I do that as well. I know a lot of people that do that. Like, it's a good way to calm yourself down, and if you have sometimes more aggressive tendencies, it's a good way to take out your aggression without actually harming anyone. Towards the more introspective side, I think it hasn't been fully explored. I think that there's a lot more that games can do, and because they have a very large range of how they can emotionally impact people. But it hasn't been explored to the extent it could be, mostly because I believe it would very much help if large studios gave their monetary backing to projects like that, but they're also not as commercially viable, so that's unlikely to happen. Danny?
Yes. Okay. I have two questions.
Okay.
If you could if you could play one game for the rest of your life, what would it be? And I wouldn't suggest picking a story mode game because like.
I understand. So Danny asks, if I could play one game for the rest of my life, what would it be? Probably League of Legends. I wasn't going to choose Fortnite.
Okay, next question.
Mhm.
How do you think that Assassin's Creed has a good, like, I know you were talking about like picture earlier. I don't know what the technical word you would call it. Well, no, not graphics. You said something about like photorealism.
Oh, okay. Yep. Photorealism. Assassin's Creed isn't fully photorealistic. They go for a realism aspect, but they tone it down to apply their own art style to it so that it still, because their games are historically based, but aren't very much or even at all completely true to history. So they use that leeway that they've gained themselves by not being completely true to history to also allow themselves to add their own touches to the art, the historical art style. Belle?
You and I have talked about some of the classes you'll be taking at college.
Yeah.
That go with your major. Can you just share a couple titles of those classes so we know what you'll be studying? I don't know. Sorry.
I don't know if I have all of them memorized, but Belle's asking just what are some of the titles of some of the classes.
There was some ethics.
There are a lot of ethics classes. One of them is just one of them I'm going to be taking is just the ethics in video games is one of them. There's also just some general design classes. There's actually a senior project. It's a full year project that I work on with either 5 people or 140 people, depending. And you have to make a game and you have to ship this game or you don't graduate. And then there's some other interesting ones like the ethics and economy of sex, drugs, and crime, and some other classes that I can take as optional classes. Aiden?
Is there a specific genre of game that you would prefer to design?
Aiden asked if there's a specific genre of games I prefer to design. I like games like Hyper Light Drifter. I mean, I like all games, so I'd make anything happily, but I really like MOBAs, and they're fun to multiplayer online battle arena, so Dota 2, League of Legends, Heroes of the Storm, those sort of games. I like the idea of creating characters for them, and I actually do that for fun. So working one of those would be great. Otherwise, like games like Hyper Light Drifter are just some of my favorite like aspect of game, like perspective styles. So creating a game similar to like Zelda or something like that, those games are also really fun to design. Carissa?
Did you do a lot of your research based on like story games, or did you go into like arcade games at all? If you did, what did you do? And if not, why didn't you kind of go into it?
So for my research on like emotions, Chris asks if I did more of my research on story games, or if I did more of, or if I also branched into more arcade style games. Most of my research was done in story based games because if we're going for emotional type things, arcade games generally didn't have much or any storyline to them. And the way a lot of games affect emotions is through the storyline. I have looked into a little bit with games that affect throughout without storyline. A lot of arcade games, mainly their emotional impact was either pride or frustration, though. So I set the high score, I'm proud of myself, or I died, now I have to put another quarter in, I'm pissed. So they didn't inspire me to look into them more. Yeah. Oh, both of you do? Okay. Will?
One of my favorite studios is id Software because
Mhm.
they had a sort of a DIY attitude.
Yep.
And they've made quite just my favorite game.
Mhm.
So my question is, have you considered branching off and sort of getting a bunch of people together and trying to do your own thing,
Mhm.
like a small compact team? Or-
Yeah. Will asks if I have thought of creating my own company and my own team and creating just what I want to make. And my answer is I would prefer to do that. It's not. I'd love to. The only problem with it is it's hit or miss. So if I get a hit, I can eat. If I don't get a hit, I might have to only eat ramen for the next few months. So, because that's not very healthy, Danny. So I'd love to. Bye, Grandma. But I just want to. I'm going to play it a little safe, and when I get out of college, I'm going to make sure I at least take care of some of my debt before I do something risky like starting my own company. Seth?
Sorry for asking another question.
No, you're totally fine.
You keep talking about like the emotional impact in video
Yep.
games, and I wanted to know, first of all, a game in which you have gotten the most attached to the characters in.
Okay.
What game has gotten you most attached to the characters, and how you think it was able to pull that off?
So Seth asks, what game have I gotten most attached to the characters in, and why? So there's two games made by the same studio, Transistor and Pyre. Two really fantastic indie games. And how they do it is part of it. Their characters, they build a lot in just focusing on their characters. Pyre is a game where you have a team of characters, kind of, and they're exiles, and there's a specific way they have to get back into normal society, and you're helping them through that. And like 20% of the game is gameplay, and the other like 80% is talking with those characters. And so you just have conversations with them. And they don't all go back at once. So you have to choose characters to send back and keep the rest of them, which ends up being a lot more difficult than you would think, because normally like you'd go, oh, well, this one's the least useful for my current team loadout, I'll just get rid of you, but ends up being harder than that. Yeah.
Thank you, Matt.
All right.